Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to be talking about a really interesting, important, and famous ethical theory known as virtue ethics. So, without further ado, let's get to it. So here's the plan for this little clip. We're going to talk about how virtue ethics is different from other ethical theories. We're going to ask the question of how we do the right thing according to virtue ethics. And then we'll look at two problems for virtue ethics. One known as the contradiction problem, and the other one known as the priority problem. And these are discussions of virtue ethics and challenges for virtue ethics that are coming out of this book right here by Russ Shafer-Landau, A Concise Introduction to Ethics. So, let's get to it. The really interesting thing about virtue ethics is that it's different in some really important ways from other ethical theories. In your study of ethics, you'll have learned that other theories of right and wrong try to explain all moral duties in terms of a single rule. Not every single theory, but famously, utilitarians and Kantians try to explain all of morality in terms of a single guiding principle. So for utilitarians, that's going to be the principle of utility. And for Kantians, it's going to be in terms of what they call the categorical imperative, right? And they're going to say, we can understand each and every one of your moral duties in terms of what we might think of as like a simple rule that you can apply. But virtue ethics, on the other hand, is going to deny this approach is a good one. So the virtue ethicist is going to say you can't actually explain all of morality in terms of a single principle, so it's not possible, nor is it desirable. We wouldn't actually want to reduce ethics to a single rule. You can't really do ethics like math or like the application of a simple formula, the virtue ethicist might think. Now, one way of sort of showing how we're going to get a different approach from the virtue ethicist is that oftentimes the main question that we're asking, according to other theories, is the question of what are my moral obligations? Or to put it in even simpler terms, it might be asking the question like, what should I do in this situation? What is the action that I have the most reason to perform? So that's what other ethical theories are often focusing on. Virtue ethics, on the other hand, at least on Shafer-Landau's reading, the most fundamental question for virtue ethics is the question, what sort of person should I be? And the idea is, what kind of person you're going to be is a more foundational and more interesting question than asking about what the exact rules of a situation are. One reason why we might prefer the virtue ethicist's approach is that ethics isn't so simple. And especially when we're trying to figure out what to do in our own lives, it's not like there's a rule book. And in fact, when it comes to making hard ethical decisions, instead of applying a theory, rather, you should just make sure that you are a good person to begin with. And then when it comes to difficult situations, you're going to be better equipped for dealing with those situations. Once we start saying, well, what kind of person should I be? Well, the virtue ethicist is going to say, well, you should be a virtuous person, or you should develop some virtues. Well, what is a virtue? Well, Shafer-Landau suggests that, and I think that this is a fair definition, a virtue is an admirable character trait that enables its possessor to achieve what is good. So it is like a way of being that enables you to get things right in the world, to do morally well. Now, some people might think of virtues as habits. I think that Schaefer-Landau rightly points out that not only is having virtue about doing the right thing all the time, and doing it reliably and predictably, but we might actually say that not only is it what you do, but it's also the things that you notice. And so you might think of a person who is incredibly charitable or benevolent, might be more perceptive about when there are people in need. So for instance, when it gets colder outside in these winter months, maybe a particularly benevolent person might be more mindful of how the cold weather is hard on homeless people. And they might do more for people who are experiencing homelessness, such as maybe donating some clothing or putting in some volunteer hours at a shelter, right? So the things that you perceive, the things that you think about, right? So, a benevolent person wouldn't have blaming thoughts towards homeless people. They would rather have compassionate thoughts. And moreover, not only are you doing the right things and noticing the right stuff, but you're doing it in a way that's motivated correctly. So the thought here is that not only do virtuous people do the right thing, but when they do the right thing, they feel good about doing the right thing. So in this way, whereas somebody like Kant might tell us that morally admirable behavior is when you do the right thing, even though you really want to do the bad thing instead, virtue ethics might say, actually, the really admirable thing is to have doing the right thing come to you naturally, and to do the right thing and feel good about it in the process. So in this way, we could say that when you have the virtues, you're going to do the right thing, and you're going to do it with the right motive and with the right things in mind. So it's like right actions for the right reasons with good results. Schaefer-Landau does not mention this in the book, but I'm going to bring it in because I think it answers the question of what a virtue is quite nicely. Virtue ethics is a very ancient theory, and it goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle. One thing that Aristotle pointed out in a really interesting and helpful way is that a virtue, he said, it's sort of like hitting things right on target. It's a mean between two excesses, right? So here's the classic example. Aristotle is going to tell us that one of the virtues is courage, right? You are admirable, and it helps you to achieve what's good if you are a courageous person. Now, if we think about this in military terms, we could say that to have courage, we could say it's a mean between two excesses, right? And we might say that, well, we have courage here, right? And we might say that if you overdo it with courage, well, we might call that rashness, right? So the courageous person is running into battle, even though it's scary, right? But we might think that the person who's rash is not only running into battles even when it's scary, but they're also running into battles at the wrong time. Like they're jumping the gun. So it's kind of like courage, but you're overdoing it. Now here's the second thought. And this is that you can also underdo it with courage, right? So we might also say that cowardice, right? So if you're unable to run into any battles, well, then you're a coward, right? So the idea is to be courageous is to be hitting the target when it comes to matters of dealing with things that can be scary. It's not like you're going to jump into every situation and not have any fears, but it's also not like you're going to be ruled by your fears. So it's about getting things right on target. And we might think of any number of virtues like this, right? So not only courage, but you might also think of benevolence. You could be stingy on the one hand, but you could be, overly selfless, even self-effacing, if you are spending maybe too much time looking out for the well-being of others, right? We might also think of, being honest as a virtue, right? And we might say, well, if you lack that motive towards honesty, you might be dishonest, or you might be withholding of information. That might be the deficiency. But some people might think that there's also such thing as being too honest, right? Somebody asks you how you're doing and you tell them every single thing about what's going on in your day. Or you have a person who's so into telling people true things that they start blabbing about other people's secrets. So we might think that honesty is another virtue, which is the mean, that is like the sweet spot, hitting things on target between two extremes. Right. So how do we do right according to virtue ethics? Well, the first thing is that we take being a good person as our first notion, and then we think about what rightness is after we've figured out our picture of what a good person is. So Schaefer-Landau gives us sort of a formula. Here is the virtue ethical theory of what it is to do the right thing. So VE, this is just an abbreviation for like the thesis, the virtue ethical thesis. VE says an act is morally right just because it's one that a virtuous person acting in character would do in that situation. So one thing that we might say here is like, look, this is a way of saying, look, if you were in the situation you were in, we might ask, if you were in a situation where the only way to feed your family was to steal a loaf of bread, well, we might ask the question, well, would that be morally right? And we'd be saying, well, it would be morally right if stealing that loaf of bread is what a virtuous person acting in character would do in that situation. So we might ask the question, like, well, think of your favorite example of a virtuous person, Jesus or Martin Luther King or Mother Teresa. And then we'd ask, well, in that situation, would they steal a loaf of bread to feed their family? And if we think to ourselves, yeah, they would, then doing what they would do, that would be the right thing. Another way that we can think about this is you start with virtues, and then once you've got an understanding of the virtues, so this might be, again, courage or honesty or benevolence, then these pictures of a good person are going to give us rules for acting. So the virtue of courage, that would generate the rule, be courageous. It would also generate the rule, don't be a coward. Right? So we find rules for living by thinking about what the virtuous agent would do. Now, it's quite true that sometimes, you might think that being benevolent might tell you to do one thing, but being just might require you to do another thing. So if you ever become a teacher, you might catch a student cheating one day. Sometimes it happens. And you might find yourself with a real dilemma, right? On the one hand, you might feel, a responsibility to punish that student for cheating, maybe giving them a 0 or reporting them to, a main office at the school. And you might realize that justice is telling you to punish, even though benevolence, like it will still hurt you as a teacher sometimes to punish a student for doing a bad thing. Now, in those cases, when the virtues conflict, you look to the example of a moral exemplar. So a moral exemplar is simply like a role model, right? It's sort of another way of talking about the virtuous person acting in character. So if you want to figure out the right thing to do, we can start to ask those questions like what would, and then pick out your moral exemplar and figure out what they would do. So I might think back to, trying to imagine what my role model teachers have done in the past in situations where students have acted badly, right? And in those cases, we might say, look, we've got a push and pull between justice and benevolence here. Thinking to my teachers, I think that justice would probably win out in this case. It hurts to punish people sometimes, but in the end, you probably realize that you've got to do the right thing and you've got to be consistent. And I might further realize that by realizing that's what my best teachers would have done in this situation. So that's the picture of virtue ethics. We sort of work on habits and traits, excellences of human character, and in the process, we learn how to do this better by taking the example of others into account. Now, here's a problem for virtue ethics. I just said that the way to do virtue ethics might be to look to what moral exemplars would do. Let's go back to that example of stealing bread to feed your family. Now, I'll make one little revision. We'll say, look, you need to feed your family somehow, and stealing bread is an option on the table, but maybe there are a few other options. Maybe you could, beg for food, or maybe you could call up a friend, or maybe do something else. And now imagine if we ran this case by a number of people. I've thought of some people who were sometimes named as moral exemplars. So we have Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we have Socrates, we have Mother Teresa. Now, some of you might find some of these people to be exemplars, but not others. Maybe you think that all three of them are admirable in some way. But we might realize that what if, King said it was okay, Socrates said it wasn't okay, and Mother Teresa said it was okay, right? So in that situation, now we're starting to wonder, well, is it right to steal a loaf of bread? Well, we have one question, which is just, which of these people is the true moral exemplar? And we might find it weird that some people might pick King and Socrates and not Teresa, but other people would only pick Teresa, and some people would pick Teresa and King, but not Socrates, and so on and so forth, right? But if we admit that there is something deeply admirable about each of these figures, if we admit that they are all fine moral examples that we would do well to emulate, we should notice that not all moral exemplars, even when they're acting in character, are going to do the same thing in the same circumstances. It might just be true that some of these people would steal that bread, but other people wouldn't, right? But in those cases, we might say, well, an act is right if a moral exemplar would do it. An act is not right if a moral exemplar would not do it. Well, then we're left in the situation where virtue ethics is giving us contradictory advice, right? It is both right and not right to steal the bread. Now, Schaefer-Landau, our textbook author, Schaefer-Landau, he suggests a revision. And here's what Schaefer-Landau suggests. He said, an act is morally required if all moral exemplars would perform it. And an act is morally permissible if some, but not all, moral exemplars would permit it. So if we're going to the example of the stolen loaf of bread, well, if King and Teresa would do it, but Socrates wouldn't, and if we admit that they are all true moral exemplars, well, then we would say it's not a required action. You don't have to steal the bread, but it's permissible because some, but not all of them would steal the bread, right? We can also say that an act would be morally impermissible. That is, like, not only not right, but it is wrong if no moral exemplar would perform the action. Now, in this way, we can say, look, there might be some things that any decent person would do. You know, they wouldn't fail to aid a person in need, or they would all tell the truth when given an opportunity, and it wouldn't cost them anything. And there are some things that no moral exemplars would do, right? So we would say that, like, look, no moral exemplar would commit genocide, for instance, right? And we might say that once we get a little clearer on the difference between being required to do something, being permitted to do something, and being, required not to, or being in a situation where an action is impermissible, then we might be able to work our way through this problem of contradiction. So that's like our first problem for virtue ethics. Well, if we're supposed to just do what a virtuous agent would do, well, sometimes we might get some head scratchers about, well, conflicting advice from different virtuous agents. Now, here's a second problem for virtue ethics, and this is called the priority problem. And the priority problem, we might frame it as a question, right? And here's the question. Are actions right because virtuous agents perform them? Or are agents virtuous because they perform right actions? Now, think about that for a second. We might ask the question, for instance, is giving to charity a good thing because virtuous agents give to charity? Or should we say that do certain people count as virtuous agents because they give to charity? Or let's go to another example. One of the most clearly immoral behaviors is sexual assault, right? Now we might ask, is sexual assault wrong because no virtuous agent would ever do such a thing? Or are people virtuous because one thing about them is that they know they would never sexually assault somebody? Now, if we think about this for a minute, it seems like Schaefer-Landau leans towards the answer, and I think I lean towards this answer as well, that this first answer, because virtuous agents perform them, that's not correct, right? Or agents virtuous because they perform right actions, that seems right, right? Like, there's a reason why we think of Martin Luther King as a moral exemplar. It's because, for instance, he fought for justice and equal civil rights in America. Or we could realize that Mother Teresa is considered a moral exemplar because she worked hard to heal and help the sick and the poor, right? So you would say that these are agents who are virtuous because they perform right actions. But this leads to a problem with the virtue ethical thesis, that right acts are right because they're performed by virtuous agents, right? So here's what Schaefer-Landau tells us towards the end of the chapter. We can still look to virtuous role models for reliable guidance on how to act, but their choices do not turn otherwise neutral actions into ones that are right or wrong. if this line of thinking is on track, we need to explain virtue in terms of duty and not the other way around. So in this way, the starting idea, what was supposed to make virtue ethics distinctive, is that it was supposed to focus on what it is to be a good person prior to focusing on the question of what our moral duties and responsibilities are. But if we're on the right track here, it seems like we actually need to have the concept of moral duties before we have the concept of a virtuous agent, because the virtuous agent is the one who acts in accord with certain duties. So if that's the right line of thought, at least this one version of virtue ethics, which tells us that we need to understand the concept of a good person before we understand the concept of a moral obligation, and the idea that we can understand moral obligations in terms of what a good person is, well, that seems to be mistaken if we're going to say that agents are virtuous because they perform actions that are right. So this seems to be a problem for this particular version of virtue ethics that tries to understand right action in terms of the concept of a virtuous agent. Now, I will point out, even Aristotle himself doesn't really claim that doing the right thing is to be understood in terms of what a good moral agent would do. So this might be a problem that's more so a problem for certain interpreters of Aristotle rather than Aristotle himself. And even if virtue ethics isn't a good theory of moral duties, we might still ask the question of whether doing philosophy that theorizes about the virtues is a worthwhile thing. And I think that we might be able to answer that question affirmatively. That is, virtue ethics might still be useful because it might actually have better advice for ordinary people like you and me to figure out how to act well in this world. Right? So the utilitarian theory of, trying to figure out the best possible result from your actions, or the Kantian theory of respecting the principle of universalizability or humanity, when you actually try to apply those theories in real life, you're not going to do very well, or at least much of the time you're going to mess things up pretty badly from a moral point of view. But if you learn to be a virtuous agent who has good habits, who is perceptive about the subtleties of a situation, and who is truly motivated to do the right thing because doing the right thing feels good, well, we might think that, theories of virtue ethics, theories of the many virtues that a person might possess, that might be the sort of practical advice that a lot of people are trying to get out of an ethics course. And in that way, we might still have something quite important to learn from virtue ethics. So we've seen what virtue ethics is all about, how it's different from other theories, and how it offers moral advice in this world. We've also seen some challenges for the theory. Thanks for listening in, and be well. Take care.